Come on down, you gotta get a piece of paper before you sit down. The question has to do with dealing with people who are not represented. And so when I'm thinking about this as a problem, I'm going to call it FSBO, by the way, FSBO. Hopefully that term is conversant with everybody. You're automatically, you need to understand that you're automatically behind the 8 ball for a couple of reasons. First of all, we used to control information. We had all the data, the MLS had all the data. And if consumers wanted to know where to find houses, they had to call us, right? I mean, they didn't have any choice. I mean, they could drive around and look for sale by owner signs, but that didn't work very well. Well, now folks have figured out that there's other ways to get to that data that we control. And so what that's leading to is, I mean, I hear this anecdotally from you all. I haven't really done any statistical study, but what I hear all the time is, well, there's more and more people doing for sale by owner, and so we need to figure out how to deal with it as an industry because it's a reality. And it's a reality that's being created by the internet. That darn Al Gore and the internet, you know, keeps coming back to get us, doesn't it? Because people now have access to the data in ways that we can't control. And so we have to figure out where the service is. And that's really what I want to try to focus on today is the service that we're providing, because that's what we're in. We're in the service industry. And when you go to a cocktail party and somebody says, what do you do? If you say, I sell real estate, is that true? I don't think so, actually. You're selling the service that helps buyers and sellers find each other and do deals. You're not selling real estate. You don't own the inventory. You're the marketing arm of the seller, maybe, or you're the discovery center for the buyer, but you're really not selling real estate. What you sell is the service. I was in a conversation with a lawyer here in town just in the last couple of days, and he was dealing with the concept of buyer agency, and he says, well, I just don't understand what a buyer agent brings to the table. I don't think they bring anything to the table, is what he wants to tell me. And it's this, and I'm like, well, now wait a minute, you know. I'll just use me as an example. When I buy real estate, when I went to Manhattan to buy real estate, when my kids went to school down there, I mean, I've got a broker's license. Obviously, I'm a lawyer and this is what I do. I didn't need any help writing the contract, getting the title work, finding the financing, or any of that junk. But when I went to Manhattan to buy a house, I did hire a buyer's agent. Well, why did I hire one? Well, I think I'm a fairly astute consumer of real estate services, and I understood that buyer agents had a service that they could sell me. Nothing I couldn't have done for myself, but I didn't want to do it myself. But see, the difference between me and the average consumer is I do understand the service that you all sell. And so when I sat down with a broker in Manhattan and said, okay, I need to buy a house in Manhattan, here's my intention. I'm going to own it for approximately 8 years, and I'm going to sell it. I've got 2 daughters that are going to live in it and manage it. So I want it to be a neighborhood that works for all that. I'd like to make a little money along the way, but I really just want to be able to sell it at the backside, you know. So what I'm really worried about is I want to find it, I want to get a good deal now, I want to be able to resell it on the backside. Now, little did I know what would happen in the Manhattan market in the intervening years, which of course Manhattan has proven to be, whether you know it or not, the best real estate market in the state of Kansas for like the last 15 years. Can't go wrong buying something in Manhattan recently. Kansas City has actually come out ahead of Manhattan this year, but Manhattan has led the state for years in terms of being a good market. Increasing prices, lots of volume, no downturn in the '08 crash, just everything was steady and just moved, okay? Lots of reasons. K-State has more on-campus enrollment today than KU. Do you know that? K-State's bigger than KU on-campus enrollment. Now, you start counting off-campus and their satellite campuses and all kinds of stuff, and it gets real weird. But in terms of the on-campus, K-State's ahead. So one part of it was K-State. Another part of it was Fort Riley. Okay. okay? Another part of it was the federal infusion with the MBAT facility, okay? Lots of construction jobs, okay? So I didn't know that I was falling into that when I fell into that, but when I went to hire a buyer's agent, I wanted a specific group of services. This is what I want. And I told her, I said, now, I know as a buyer's agent, typically you sell a whole bunch of other stuff too, like you help people get financing. I don't need help getting financing, okay? I'm going to write a cash offer when I buy, okay? So don't stop worrying about that. Don't worry about ordering the title or looking at the title. I don't care what your opinion of the title is. I wasn't that blunt, but you know, I don't care. My opinion matters, okay? So I gave her a list of services I wanted. I said, now price that list of services to me. Okay, what does it cost me to buy that list? I don't want all the stuff you normally sell. I want this list. Now see, that can only happen when you have a consumer of services that's smart enough to actually understand what it is that you sell. And I'm going to suggest that therein lies your problem. Because you don't spend enough time educating the average consumer to help them understand what it is you really do. They have this vague concept of what realtors do. I just last week had a conversation with a realtor who told me that she had a buyer ask her how much car allowance the broker gave her for the car.
Yeah.
Well, I've never run into a broker that gives a car allowance. Maybe there are some out there, but you know, but that's silly, but to us, but that's what consumers think, see? And that's because consumers don't understand the service you're selling. So that would be my first thought when we're thinking about for sale by owner, is we're dealing with a buyer who doesn't understand the service we have to sell. Now we'll also suggest that the other part of the problem is we have sellers that don't believe you add value. I end up in lots of conversations every year with sellers who call me up and say, I need a real estate lawyer. Someplace out on the internet there's a website that says if you're going to do for sale by owner, here's the stuff you need to do. One of the instructions is find yourself a real estate lawyer. Now, I've never been to this website. I don't know that it exists, but I get the same phone call with the same list of questions all the time, so I'm confident someplace on the internet it says do this. And here's the questions you should ask the lawyer. And one of the questions always is, if I want to hire you to help me with my deal, what is that going to cost? And I say, well, I don't know. And they're like, well, I thought you were real estate. Well, I am, but I don't know what it's going to cost. Well, how can you not know what it's going to cost? And so I remember this conversation real well with this one lady. I said, well, let me see if I can help you understand this. What do you do for a living? She says, well, I refurnish and reupholster antique furniture. Oh, cool. That's a nice business. I said, so let me tell you, I have a dining room set and with 8 chairs, and I'd like to have the table and chairs refinished and reupholstered. What's that going to cost me? And she says, well, it depends. I don't know how many yards of material it's going to take. I don't know what finish is on there, what repair stuff has to be done. I don't know what kind of finish you want put back. I don't know what quality of yard goods you want installed. I don't know whether we're talking about brass buttons or whatever we're doing. I need to know a lot more. I said, bingo. I need to know more. See? Same thing is true for you. You have the habit of believing that when you list a property, you're going to sell this bucket of services, and that's the bucket you're going to sell. And sometimes you need to appreciate the fact not every seller wants the same bucket. Not every buyer wants the same bucket. But ultimately, you're selling service, and you have to be able to identify that. First of all, you've got to identify the service, and you have to help them appreciate the value in the service you're going to sell. Because that's something the average consumer doesn't get. Now, I hope you do. I've had the experience before where I ran into salespeople in other industries that were very good. I remember one time I was going to buy a steam carpet cleaning machine. Went to Sears. 18-year-old gal from Washburn Rural was the salesperson. And I didn't know anything about the subject, but as I was talking to her, she explained things to me. And I thought, that's a smart cookie. She kind of knows what she's selling. But at the end, I gave the typical ending piece that buyers give you all the time, which is, well, I want to look around, right? And I'll get back to you. And she says, oh, well, that's fine. She says, well, let me tell you, if you go over to Home Depot, here's the brand they sell. And here is how it works, and here's why ours is better. And if you go to Lowe's, here's the brand they sell, da-da-da-da, okay? And I'm thinking when I'm done, I think, well, holy cow, she really is a smart cookie. She understands what she's selling, which is the same thing you're selling, service and information. Okay? So I think it's important when you think about for sale by owner to start off with, where's my market, who am I trying to sell this to, and what am I selling? Because you're starting off with buyers who only want access to inventory and sellers who think they don't need you. That's where you're starting. Because think about it, if you have a person that's got a for sale by owner sign in the front yard, what are they telling you as a realtor? I don't need you, right? I can do this. Never ceases to amaze me how many people, when I have these conversations with them, oh, I can do this, you know. I remember one of this gal was a good friend of mine for 40 years, and she calls me up, she's going to sell her own house. And I said, Alona, you're a school teacher. You don't know how to sell real estate. Well, I know enough, I can do this. And I said, well, let me just tell you, if I had a house to sell, I would list it with a broker. And I have a broker's license, but I wouldn't do it myself. But even from that, I couldn't turn her, because she was so convinced that you all get paid way too much and you don't do anything, which is the perception in the public. And you know it, don't you? It's true. Okay. Not that it's factually true, but it's just that's what they think, right? Okay. Second slide says who you work for. Now, when we're thinking about for sale by owner, we have choices. Okay. We could end up working for the seller. We could end up working for the buyer, and maybe we come into the for sale by owner with a buyer agency in hand. And sometimes a buyer has hired you, and you're just not finding the right house out there in the MLS. So, but you're aware of one that has for sale by owner signs in the right neighborhood, looks right. You haven't been in it yet, of course, but it's a possibility. So sometimes you start as a buyer's agent, and sometimes you start with just a buyer that you ran into at an open house, and they're interested in the neighborhood, and you have noticed an open house down the street, and you say, well, you want to go down the street when the open house closes? Maybe we can get in that one. So it could be that you come into this with, in effect, being a transaction broker because you don't have a buyer agency agreement signed. Could be you come into it with a buyer agency. And in some cases, maybe you spot a for sale by owner and you're thinking, okay, I have some buyers that might be interested in that, maybe I should try to get it listed, and that's what you do, so you approach it from a seller agency standpoint. Okay? So the first thing is, who are we going to represent? Now you notice the first bullet point says, list it. Common misconception among brokers, one of the, I guess, urban legends of real estate. You have to list a house in order for it to be sold, or somebody has to list the house to sell, to be involved. Not true. Never has been the law. Okay? Never has been the law. But a lot of people think it is. Okay? It's not true. You can sell it without listing it. Okay? So you knock on my door, I've got a for sale by owner sign, you've got a buyer agency agreement with someone, and you say, hey, I've got a buyer who might be interested in a house, you see out there in the cars, this person, would you be willing to let me show your house? Okay? You don't have to list it. Now, some of your companies have a form called a one-time showing agreement. Okay? That's a good tool. I really like that tool. There's a variety of forms out there. There's no magic form. The reason it's a good tool is kind of multifold. One is, it's a good idea, I think, to have in writing that the seller has agreed to let you do this. And probably more importantly, if you get it sold, you'd kind of like to have an agreement on who's going to pay you. Now, if you have a buyer agency agreement, you have an agreement with the buyer already. But if you don't have a buyer agency agreement, who's going to pay you? Now, if we were on the multi-list and I'm showing one of his listings, now I know who's going to pay me, don't I? Because in the multi-list, he said, I offer you X% of the sale price if you sell my listing, right? And so when I show that listing, the NAR rules tell us that that's an offer of compensation, and when I show it, I'm accepting that offer. Okay? So I know how I'm getting paid in this transaction. But when it's for sale by owner, the question of how am I going to get paid is unresolved. Okay? So one way to resolve it is have a buyer agency agreement. Another way to resolve it is have a one-time showing agreement where hopefully the seller has agreed to pay you. Okay? Now, a third way that does work, but there's some risk associated with it, and that is you put it in the sale contract itself. If you went back, oh, I don't know, you know what happens when you get old and you think everything was last year, and then it really turns out it was 5 years ago, and if you say it was 5 years ago, then it was 15. It's hard for me to place some of this stuff historically because I've been doing this so long. 40 years next year is how long I've been doing this. That's a long time to do anything. And you might ask somebody that obviously is only 50 how they could possibly been doing the same thing for 40 years. But some people in the room know how old I actually am, so that probably won't work. It is possible for me to have done it for 40 years because next year it will be. But at some time in the past, I'm going to say approximately 25 years ago, the Real Estate Commission used to tell us that we could not put our commission statement in the contract. Okay? Their argument was that because the who's going to pay the realtor statement is a contract between the realtor and somebody, but we're not a party to the buy-sell contract, that's the buyer and sellers are the parties, that we shouldn't put that compensation in there. Now, I argued with them at the time because I can tell you from a lawyer's perspective, for 40 years, when I have written sale contracts, I always put in the sale contract who's going to pay the various real estate professionals involved, because it's a lot more than just you. Okay? You know, we worry about who's going to pay the mortgage broker, don't we? We worry about who's going to pay the termite inspection, the whole house inspection, the title work, the taxes. I mean, we've got all kinds of who's going to pay who in the contract, don't we? So the idea that one of those service providers in the list couldn't be mentioned was silly. Okay? And ultimately, in the last, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, the Real Estate Commission has decided that yes, it's okay. Now, you'll still run into brokers who believe the urban legend, which is you can't put commissions in a sale contract. It's not true. So in a for sale by owner deal, that can be helpful. And just go ahead and put it in additional provisions. You know, who's going to pay the realtors, the various realtors involved. Okay? I have absolutely no problem with that. Agency disclosure. We need to have agency disclosure in the contract. Now, of course, that first of all starts with the agency disclosure brochure that you're supposed to hand out. Now, state law does not require that you get that signed. Some brokers require that you get it signed, but state law does not. I think it's a reasonably good idea to have it signed by the consumer saying yes, they received it, but in the sale contract you have that language in your Topeka form, Sunflower area form, that lists, it's got 2 blocks, doesn't it? It says who represents the buyer and who's working with the seller, right? And what kind of agency do you have? Well, obviously that's going to apply even in this for sale by owner transaction. So agency disclosure is kind of 2 parts. One, we should have, if we're the only agent and the salesperson in the transaction, we should have given each party one of those brochures, right? And we need it in the contract what our agency is once we've figured it out, okay? All right, the next slide is the pricing question. And that's we're on the bottom slide on the front side of the page now. The pricing question, or CMA, comparative market analysis. Lots of people get confused about this. And in my opinion, it's actually really, really simple, okay? The comparative market analysis, CMA, whatever you want to call it, I don't care who you give it to. You can give it to everybody. Now, that assumes something, which is that your CMA is honestly prepared. And what I mean by this is, if you're the listing agent and you've done a CMA, certainly you're going to give it to the seller even before you get the listing, probably, right? Now, if you gave it to the seller before you had the listing, what was your agency relationship with that seller at the time you handed them that CMA? You're a transaction broker, aren't you? Because the law says you're a transaction broker until you become something else. And in this case, we're going to become a seller's agent, but we ain't there yet, right? So we're a transaction broker when we hand out that CMA. Now, isn't that interesting? You may have thought that transaction brokers don't do CMAs, but clearly you do. Because anytime you do one pre-listing, you're handing it out to as a transaction broker. Okay? So We can do one as a seller's agent. We can do one apparently as a transaction broker. Can we do one as a buyer's agent? Sure. Yeah, you can do it as a buyer's agent. Now, my thought is this. Let's assume he's a for sale by owner, and she's my buyer, client. I've got an agency agreement with her. And in doing the search for various properties, I've done CMAs for her on various properties, probably. And now we're down to this property. And I'm going to do a CMA. No problem. He says to me, well, have you done a market analysis? Smart consumer. He actually knows what realtors do, doesn't he? Can I give him the same CMA I did for her or prepare one for him now? Yes. As long as your CMA is honestly prepared. Now, if I have artificially pushed the numbers down on the one I'm going to give him, is that honest? It's not, is it? Now, my point really is this. Your CMA should always be honestly prepared. If you're pushing the numbers up when you're at his house trying to get the listing, that's a bad idea. First of all, it's dishonest. Okay? And secondly, if you get the listing, what's going to happen? It ain't going to sell, is it? It's going to be overpriced, and you know what happens when houses are overpriced. One thing, they don't sell. Right? And now you're back in 45 days later saying, well, we're not getting a lot of activity, maybe we need to reduce the price. Now, if he's smart, he's saying, so you pushed it up to get the listing, and now you're trying to get me to push it down. Which is exactly right. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that every broker price opinion, every CMA is going to be absolutely accurate, because I believe, fundamentally, frankly, that if she does one and I do one on the same house in the same day, they probably don't have the same answer. Okay? You know, appraisers don't agree a lot of the times. You know, I do a lot of eminent domain work representing landowners against the government. So I've seen appraisals that, well, we had a hearing last month over in Kansas City on this hotel, and one appraiser said it was 2.17 million, and somebody else said it was 6 million. That's just a reasonable difference of opinion. I had a 1/10 of an acre in Marion County down west of Emporia. One time, a 1/10 of an acre out in the middle of nowhere. KDOT's appraiser said 2,300, I believe it was. My appraiser said 37,000. Just a reasonable difference of opinion. 1/10 of an acre. Now, it might help you to understand that this was a 1/10 of an acre off of a 1 acre convenience store site. It was a gas station bait store next to a lake. And the 1/10 of an acre that KDOT took included the 2 entrances off the highway.
Oh my goodness.
So are you really buying a 1/10 of an acre, or are you buying some other stuff with it, see? So my point is, if licensed appraisers with the highest credentials possible can vary by hundreds of percents, then can she and I differ by 5%? I think so. I think that's okay. So I'm not saying she's dishonest or I'm dishonest if we don't have the same answer. I hope we're both honest. We just have difference of opinion about market trends and what's going on in a particular neighborhood or with a particular kind of home, perhaps. That's okay. All right? But I want it to be intellectually honest. I haven't pushed it up or pushed it down. I didn't push it down because I was on the buyer side. Let's talk about that for a minute. If I have pushed it down on the buyer's side, am I really doing a good service for my buyer? No. Because it may be that now she makes an offer that's too low. This is her dream home. This is the absolute home that she wants to own. And now she loses it to another bidder because she came in low. Have you ever had a seller, when somebody comes in low, who says, I don't want any more offers from that buyer. I'm not going to talk to him anymore. I've actually had that happen to me. Remember the house I was buying down in Manhattan? I had 2 sellers say to their realtors, don't ever bring offers from him again. Didn't hurt my feelings a bit. I mean, I knew why they were saying it. Okay, now, irritated the beans out of my daughter, who was going to move into the house because she'd fall in love with it, but that's a different question. See, for me, it was an investment opportunity. I was either going to buy it right or I wasn't going to buy it, and I didn't care. You know? She fell in love first. That happens to some buyers, doesn't it? Emotion. Okay, so my point with the CMA is I don't care what agency hat you're wearing, you can do one. You should do one. but it should always be honestly prepared. Okay? And that doesn't mean next week on the same house you don't have a different answer than you had this week. Sometimes there's new market data out there, isn't there? Things change. It doesn't mean she and I have to agree. Okay? It just needs to be honest. That's your opinion today. Okay? Okay, to flip the page, disclosure issues. What to disclose. The rules in for sale by owner are exactly the same as the rules in conventional. You're going to list it and you're going to sell it. Okay? And what is the rule? Somebody tell me. What do you have to disclose?
What you know.
What you know. And that's it. The license law says what you actually know. By the way, I didn't say this. I'm happy to answer questions. Y'all are being very polite, not interrupting anything, but I would be happy to answer. And it's more entertaining if you ask questions, for me at least. Maybe not for you, but for me. You have to disclose what you actually know.
On the previous slide, the phone numbers that you had listed under pricing issues, those are for us to.
Yeah, you can call me. Those are my phone
Those are your
numbers.
numbers.
Yeah. My cell number is published all kinds of places. You're not. Now I may look at it, if it's in the evening, I may look at it and say, I don't know that number and I ain't going to take the call. So don't be offended. You don't ever do that, do you? Just look at caller ID and.
No, 3 a.m. maybe.
Oh, okay. Well, no, mine's about 6 o'clock, so. Well, it depends what I'm doing, I guess. No, yeah, I put my phone number there, so I don't care. Now, you need to understand, lawyers sell time. I mean, I know what I sell. It's service, but it's basically measured in time. Now, that doesn't mean you get charged every time you call me, but if you're gonna call to seek an opinion, particularly if you need me to look at documents and stuff like that, then, you know, it's just like eating at the restaurant. If you order food, you're gonna pay for it, and even if it's the daily special and you don't know what the daily special cost is because they didn't tell you, that doesn't mean it's free. So, now, some of you belong to the hotline, which is a service that you sign up for upstairs, Kansas Association of Realtors, and you pay an annual fee, and then you can call me as many times as you want, and you get an opinion letter with each call. So, all for one annual fee. So, anyway, yes, those are my real phone numbers. All right?
So you
Now,
figure a net sheet. A net sheet would be what you know, right? What their charges are less what their mortgage payoff is.
yes,
Because you probably wouldn't know.
true. Unless they've given you access to the numbers, then you wouldn't know.
And for some owners, typically no.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so we're going to disclose what we know. Now, the other thing we're supposed to do is we're supposed to say, here's what I know, but oh, by the way, there are expert opinions you ought to get. Okay? And those expert opinions, of course, the whole house inspections and termites, and if it's out in the country, a septic inspection and all that sort of thing. Now, we get into some more perhaps esoteric areas like, say, water wells. Okay? We don't have a lot of those in Shawnee County where people are using for drinking water, but we have some. The water well tests, those of you that don't ever sell rural properties might not think about this, but and the real point is, if you don't know about a subject, you need to get some help. But if you're talking about water wells, one question is the water drinkable? Some people have water wells that are used for watering the lawn, but you shouldn't ought to be drinking the water. Okay. Another kind of water well test is how much water do you get? Okay, do you get enough water to actually have a family of 5 live in a house? Or do you get enough water that is okay as long as all you're doing is cooking and drinking with it? You know, some wells don't have enough capacity. Okay, yes, sir.
Since we're talking about for sale by owners here, when we're talking about disclosure issues, are we talking about if we're representing the buyer, or if we're talking to the seller about what the seller would need to disclose to the buyer?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I just want clarification
Actually,
with regard to
but that's a very good question and a good point. If you're on a for sale by owner, then because there's no listing agent that sat down with them and gave them a property disclosure form, they don't have that, or they may, because some of them have done their homework and they've gone out and figured out, okay, this is probably something I need to do. But if you're knocking on the door, and I would say regardless of whether you're a buyer agent, a transaction broker, or you want to get the listing, if you're knocking on the door trying to help sell that property, probably a good idea to pull out the disclosure form and say you need to complete this. Or your buyer writes an offer perhaps that's contingent on getting a property condition report that they have a chance to review for 5 days and object to or something like that.
Okay.
But yes, I mean, urging, if you're on the buyer side of the transaction, then urging the buyer to require the seller to cough up a seller disclosure form, pretty good idea.
Right. I mean, because we know what we would be doing if we were listing the property, what would be disclosed. We know, or should know, what we would want the buyer to have
Careful about that
disclosed.
should have known.
Yeah, disclosed to them
Yeah.
in the purchase of the property.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're on the buyer side of the transaction, then you need to think about, okay, what would my buyer be getting if this property were listed?
Right.
And of course, pretty much standard form, most everybody does is some kind of a seller disclosure form.
Right.
And that's almost a standard in the industry today. Now, the problem, of course, you run into people who won't fill them out. You probably all have had that. The craziest is I've run into situations where sellers have said, well, my lawyer told me to not fill it out. And I would think that's a lie, except I've heard it so many times, I think it's the truth. I think there are lawyers who tell people not to fill them out, which is stupid in my opinion. I mean, you know, Kansas law is pretty clear. If you know about a defect, you have to disclose it, okay? So from a seller's perspective, seller disclosure forms are good for sellers because that way the seller can record, okay, here's the stuff that I know about, and I'm telling the truth as best I recall it. Now, the hard part, you get sellers who've lived in a place for a long time, they forget stuff, you know? And, I mean, they honestly forget. It's not just made up, I forgot. It's they just honestly forget because it hadn't bothered them for a long time, you know? So, it's not a perfect science.
So it's okay for us to give them our forms, because doesn't it say for use of the Sunflower Board?
Okay, she says, is it okay then to give them our forms, because don't the forms include a copyright statement, which they do. Yes, your forms are valuable, okay, and that copyright statement on the form is, I think, very important. It's a valuable resource that you've paid for, whether you know it or not. I mean, there's a volunteer group, you know, the risk management committee of your local board spends a lot of time every year working on those forms. They have to run them by me. And, you know, we're on retainer here with Sunflower to provide advice, and one of the things we do is look at forms and approve them. So in effect, you're paying for those forms as a part of your dues. That's in there. So if you're going to pay for something, it's kind of like, you know, buying the book. Shouldn't you have the right to control who uses the book? And so that is an important question. However, in this case, I think you are using the form. See, when you give that form to a seller, say, well, you know, my buyer is going to want this form completed, or if the buyer has written an offer contingent upon the form, then sure, yeah, you're going to give them the form.
I'm glad to know.
Because you are using it, okay? And you have the right to make copies and do all that stuff, okay? So we're going to disclose everything we know. We're going to tell people to get qualified third-party inspections, okay? Second question says is, when are we going to disclose this stuff? Well, you need to disclose everything you know at the first opportunity. It doesn't make any sense to get 3/4 of the way through a transaction and then tell the buyer, oh, by the way, the basement leaks. If you've got a buyer who doesn't want a leaky basement, which most buyers don't. But obviously, I just can't wait for the calls next week. Did you guys drive over the Shunga today? Holy cow.
It is roaring.
It is roaring. Yeah. It was the downtown version it's actually dropped a couple of feet from its high mark. You can tell by the mud line. But holy cow, there's a lot of water running. So the leaky basement calls will start next week. I mean, I always know after a big rain in any part of the state, then I'm going to start getting calls from people. I bought a house last year and they didn't tell me the basement leaked. And you talk to the seller, well, it never leaked for us. And you're thinking, well, I don't know what the probability of that is, but trying to prove it, remember the gorilla story. Yeah. It can be hard. It's important that you disclose stuff early in the transaction, as soon as you know it. And I will add one other thing I don't think I've said here, is make sure you document that you've disclosed, okay? A lot of times we're telling people stuff over the phone or in person. And it's important that you document that you told them. Now, For me, the easiest way, if I were in your shoes, would be this. After the meeting, you get back in your car, and before you start driving, because we don't do this while we're driving, right? We send an email, glad to have shown you that property on Westview today, and while we were there, you asked me about X, and I told you why. Send the email. Now that does assume that you know where your emails live. Okay? A lot of people ask me, what about text messages? Well, same answer. I'm okay with text messages. I'm okay with emails as long as you're backed up. Now the problem with text messaging, as I understand it, AT&T claims to me that the only place my text messages live is inside this box, and they are nowhere else in the world. Now I know that's a lie because the NSA has them. So that must mean that AT&T had them at some point to give them to NSA. But other than that, I can't prove it. See, that's the problem. Now there are ways to do that. Somebody who's more technological than I and cares can explain how you preserve your text messages. There's some way to get them into your email system.
You can screenshot them, that's what I've done, screenshot them, emailed them to myself and printed them.
Okay?
Call Hillary Clinton, she can tell you.
Yeah, no kidding.
No, she can't find hers. It's a different problem.
She lost hers.
She knows where they're at.
What about recording phone conversations?
They're like huge.
Okay, Carrie asked about recording phone conversations. Kansas law says that as long as one party to the conversation knows it's being recorded, it can be recorded.
Really? So the person recording it knows, so they can record it.
So admissible in court, what makes it admissible?
She says, what makes it admissible in court? Well, if you went to court, let's say that I'm representing you in court, you've recorded a phone conversation, and we want to get that admitted in court because the other person is saying, no, we never had that conversation. Generally what we do is we take that recorded conversation, if we know we're going to need it, which we would know that someone's lying about it or claiming it didn't happen, we would transcribe that. We'd have somebody sit down and actually type up the verbatim report, and then we would go to court and we would say, Your Honor, I have a transcript of this, and here's the person who took it off of the machine, and here's the machine. And I've never had a judge decline to admit something that had been through a process like that. Okay? But we usually want to get it on paper because you know, we don't want to have to replay it every time we want the third sentence. So that's why we would transcribe it normally. And that's a real effective tool. I actually did that one time. I was talking to a guy that we knew was going to lie. I mean, his reputation was he lies about everything. And I'm talking to him on the phone, and I know he's going to lie when I get him in court. And so I recorded his conversation. And then I had the secretary transcribe it, and now we're in trial. And I'm asking him the questions, and he's lying. He's saying, no, never, didn't happen. And I said, well, did you and I have a phone call? Yeah. Well, did we talk about this? Nope, didn't talk about it. And I said, well, and I pulled out my transcript. I tape recorded the conversation, and I've had it transcribed. You want to change your statement? Judge stops it. He says, we're going to take a recess. He tells the other lawyer, would you take your client out in the hall and talk to him about perjury before he answers this question? Because he knew where I was headed. You know? And so, yeah, it works.
So whenever you, say for instance, you've got a difficult client and you choose to record what they're saying because you know, either they're not necessarily as competent as you would expect or, you know, something to that effect. You don't have to tell them you're recording them.
No. In fact, I will tell you, you know, I was in a meeting here, 2-3 weeks ago. It was an outdoor meeting. We were walking around looking at some property and with engineers, and my clients are lay folks, and about 2/3 of the way through the meeting, one half of the couple I represent announced to everybody present, well, you guys are going to have to stick with your words this time because I've been recording you. That did not help. So I would say most of the time, the fact that you recorded a conversation is something you just keep to yourself until you really, really need it. Now, how do you define when you really, really need it? I don't know. But when communications have really broken down and you're not getting anywhere, then throwing that on the table may help. But I can tell you, in that context, when we were trying to solve the problem, that was a really bad idea for her to say that. I mean, the fact that she was recording it, I mean, I didn't know she was recording it, and I didn't care. But I can tell you, the other people there did not appreciate the fact that she recorded it without telling them. I mean, if you think about it, would you like it if you found out other folks were recording your conversations? Well, no, none of us would, even if we haven't said anything wrong. We don't like it. So keep it to yourself until you need it. Unless you're recording it by mutual agreement. I mean, sometimes if you wanted to, maybe instead of taking notes, you say, how about we just record this? And then obviously it's going to be fine. Okay? Document. To whom do you disclose stuff? Everybody, right? Okay. All right, working the transaction to close. One of the problems that we have, we've been talking about this for sale by owner on the front end when we're first going to go out and show the house. Well, what we get it under contract, now we clearly are somehow involved in this deal. We're a buyer agent, a seller agent, or a transaction broker, right? So once you get a deal under contract, do they just all close on their own, or do you have to sometimes get involved? Yeah, if you just walked away from them, none of them would close, right? Or very few of them. So we're going to have to be involved. We're going to have to stay involved. Now, the important thing that I'm trying to get you to think about here is, because we're coming at this from a for sale by owner context, we don't have a listing necessarily. Now you may, but you more probably do not. Okay? So then you say, well, am I a buyer agent then? Well, maybe, and maybe not. Or I'm a transaction broker. Well, how you work the transaction to close varies depending on the answer to that question, doesn't it? And so the phrase I like to use is, remember who you work for. Okay? If you're a buyer agent, you're working for the buyer. If you're a transaction broker, you're working for the deal. Okay? If you have a listing as a seller's agent, then you're working for the seller. But my pause here would be, remember who you work for.
Then do you have to have, let's say you're a transaction broker, then do you have to have the seller sign agency to the Bretta as a transaction broker, or do they sign nothing at all?
In your firm, do you have an agency disclosure brochure that buyers and sellers sign?
Yes.
When you give it to them? Okay. That's not required by law. I was guessing that just based on the way you framed the question. That's not required at all. If no buyer or seller, and your broker will hate me, but if no buyer or no seller ever signed one of those, that would be okay. All right? With everyone except your broker. Okay? So, you know, if you go tattle on me and say, well, Vern said, I'm going to get in trouble. But I've had to deal with that many times, actually.
Well, it's just nice to know what the law is.
Yeah.
You know, because sometimes you just don't know.
Yeah. I think the reason some brokers get it signed is for twofold, from my perspective. One is to make sure that salespeople actually do it, because you're supposed to do it. Law says you're supposed to hand one of those out at the first practical opportunity. That's what the law says. Now, what better way to prove you did it than to have a signed copy? Okay, so that's just a good idea, because now we're going back to documentation, aren't we? We did something that otherwise we have no record for, so how do we prove we did it? Well, we got to sign one. We also know that in the sale contract form, it's going to say that they received a copy of it, doesn't it? Okay? Some people forget that. And so you may want to be able to say, yeah, you did. Here's your sign. Oh, yeah, I guess I did sign for that. Okay? So there's reasons to do it. And so when I say you don't have to, it's really because the law doesn't say you have to. It's just a good idea. Okay? And that's why a lot of brokers require it. And I'm not against it. I'm not against having it signed. So when you frame your question the way you did, I'm going to say, well, let's back up the bus, because we didn't really need to get it signed in the first place. Okay? And it doesn't matter whether it's signed or not. I think it's helpful with consumers sometimes to have it signed. Okay?
I have
All
a
right.
broker friend in Texas that is literally attached to every email he sends. So regardless of who it gets sent to, it's just an automated thing, so they wouldn't be able to deny that they got it.
Oh. Well, that's an interesting tool. Yeah, you can do that. Now, the only problem with that, from my perspective, is a technological one. which a lot of people, and I do think you need to respect the fact that not everybody's technology is as good as yours. You know, we all tend to have a certain level of technological savvy and equipment to work. We have to. Now, you know, one of my, I guess, daughter-in-law to be works for AT&T and sells these guys. And every time she sees my phone, she just laughs because it is so old. This is a 4S.
Same thing.
Oh, you got a 4S? Yeah. Oh, cool.
And nothing happens when you bump this too.
Yeah, nothing happens. That's the reason you can do that.
Quit being so cheap, that's what I hear. Go get one.
Yeah.
It works, doesn't it?
I hear this all the
Don't get the
time.
Windows 11.
Well, you know, my indestructible cover even got to the point where it was broken up so much I threw it away, and it still can't break the dumb thing. I mean, it keeps on running. It's like that darn battery on TV. It keeps on running. I think you have to respect other people's technology and realize that not everybody has the same number of gigabytes to send and receive. And when you add a bunch of stuff, there are folks who get irritated by that. So that's interesting. But if I had that much extra data coming every time I email somebody that I was emailing a lot, I might not like that very well. Just saying. Now, if he programmed it so that, which I don't know whether you do this, I suppose you can, so that the first time he sends an email to somebody, it goes with the first one, but it doesn't go later, that would remove that objection. And I'm not saying it's a bad idea, you understand what I'm saying. I mean, it's just, I think some folks would not like it, because it burns up too much data. If you have limited data, which some folks do, obviously. So my point about negotiating the deal to close is just paying attention to who you work for. Make sure if you're taking sides, that you're taking sides with the party you're supposed to be. Okay? And of course, scheduling and closing is kind of the same issue. Just remember whose team you're on, I guess. Okay? And now closing. There's a lot of interesting debate out there about and when a lawyer says something's interesting, especially a lawyer that has been doing the same thing for 40 years, if I say it's interesting, that means I don't know the answer. Okay? I had this gal in yesterday, and she said, I just feel so stupid. I can't believe this happened, and I feel so stupid. I told her, I said, you know, I've been doing this for 39 years, and I've never seen this happen. So quit poking yourself. She said, really? And I said, yeah. She said, oh, well, I don't feel so bad now. And it's a very unusual, very interesting problem. And I don't know how to solve it yet, but I'm going to figure it out. And that's what keeps me going, really. I mean, it's why I enjoy doing what I'm doing, because every day I get to find something that I hadn't thought of before. So this is an interesting question. What is your real role when it comes to looking at the closing documents or any other document in a transaction? There's a couple that I really think you ought to pay attention to. I can't prove in the license law that you have to, but I always think the legal description is kind of an interesting thing. We had a transaction here in Topeka a few years ago, a few meaning probably 10 now, where a builder was selling a brand new house. And the contract was written by a family member of his who was a realtor. And on the contract it said in the legal description section, per deed of record. Now the problem was when he bought the lot he built the house on, he bought 2 lots. See the problem developing? So when the title company pulled the legal description, they put lot 1 and lot 2. Apparently neither he nor his family member who was helping him with the real estate transaction bothered to look at the legal description. And so when the deal closed, the deed from him to the buyers had lot 1 and lot 2. Lot 1 being an undeveloped lot, lot 2 having the house on it, which he thought he was selling. Apparently his bank that had a mortgage on the 2 lots didn't notice when they signed the lien release, because they released the lien on both lots. Wow. All because nobody looked at the legal description. Not hard. You know, you're expecting to sell 1 lot and by golly there's 2 on there. How hard would that be to notice? Do you ever look at legals? You should, in my opinion, you know. And I think you even ought to look at them when they're meets and bounds, when they're those long ones that says begin here and go there. You gotta look at them. Now, I'm not saying you need to have an engineering license to do it, but you know, when I look at them, what I do is I get a blank piece of paper and I draw a picture. Okay? I remember one deal, I went to the closing and I drew the picture and I thought, well, this is weird, because it was 2 tracks, track 1 and track 2. I knew the parking lot was supposed to be on track 2, because if you looked at the county aerial, it showed 2 separate tracks, and there was the business building here and the parking lot here. Well, guess what? The legal description, if you drew it, looked like this. The 2 parcels joined at the corner, not one in front of the other. Huh, well, how weird is that? So we started investigating, find out, true enough, the seller owned all 3, and the legal description was just wrong. And I'm not an engineer, but I just sat with my blank piece of paper and measured it out, and I thought, well, that don't match. Okay? Something to look at. I think it's a reasonable thing to examine. Look at the closing statement. Read it. Does it appear that things have been prorated correctly? I'm not saying you need to do the math, but you know what the contract says. Who's supposed to be paying for, I don't know, pick something. The home inspection. Who's supposed to be paying for it in the contract? Is it in the right column? Okay? That's easy. It's not hard. You wrote the contract, you should know, or pull the darn thing out and look at it. Okay? I think it's reasonable to do that with whichever side of the transaction you're on, or if you're a transaction broker.
So if you're representing a buyer as a buyer's agent, and you provide that closing statement to that seller, are you responsible for going over that? Because your master is the buyer, is it not?
Sure. Yeah, no, I don't think you have an obligation to go over it. My thought about going over it really is to make sure that it represents what the deal is.
Right.
Is it actually what the deal is, or is it something else? That's my thought. I'm not representing anybody necessarily. I'm just realizing that, no offense to anybody in the title industry, title companies aren't perfect. Yeah, and you need to know that.
I have a question. So I've seen here lately, something happened with the title company in Emporia, and one of the offices is now not putting legal descriptions on the contract. They're saying that, wait to be determined by the title company when they get their title commitment back. Is that correct procedure, or should that be on there?
Well, from a legal perspective, the question is, can we look at the contract and tell what the deal is? If a judge had to resolve it, that would be the question.
Because
Okay.
to me, if there's not a legal description on there, you don't know what you're buying.
I agree with that. And for me, if I were buying, I wouldn't buy it that way. I mean, I want a legal description. As a buyer, I want a legal description because I want to know what I'm buying. I know it's extra work that somebody's got to do, but if I'm the buyer, I want to know what I'm buying. So that would be my thought. And this might seem unusual to you, but I would say in our office at any given time, we have 4 or 5 claims against title insurance companies on the title insurance policies. So you guys tend to think, okay, title insurance company does their homework, writes a policy, writes a commitment, and then a policy, oh, well, everything is fine. But no, they screw up. Sometimes the records are hard to figure out, and sometimes they miss something. We had one time where they missed the second mortgage. Oh boy. Seller got their money and left town. And of course the title company was holding the bag because they'd issued a policy that said, oh yeah, there's no lien. Well, the title company owes the money. Okay? And I mean, I could go on and on with stories about title companies screwing up, and I'm not trying to be mean to title companies. It's just they're people like the rest of us, and they screw up from time to time, and there's lots of technology to help avoid that, but it still happens. That's all. Okay? And then the last point goes back to the first point, which is, what do you do to add value? Because at the end of the day, that is the real question. How do you keep these consumers, buyers and sellers, especially in for sale by owner, when you're talking about people that don't necessarily like you, How do you produce value? What have you done? Okay, any other questions? Well, it's 1 o'clock. Did you learn anything? You didn't have lunch. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you.
See you another day.